Okay, free will, consciousness, what do you know about those phenomena? And today I'm going to invite one of the leading neuroscientists to discuss and explain these very things. Who is it? Professor Christof Koch. Hi, and welcome to my channel, The World of Roi Yozevitch. And this is your first time here. Please consider subscribing and hit the bell button. Otherwise, you wouldn't know when I upload new videos. And in this channel, we discuss science, philosophy, religion, neuroscience, everything. And my guest today, and it's truly a great honor, is Professor Christof Koch. Christof Koch is one of the leading neuroscientists of our time. He is best known for his work on the neural basis of consciousness. He is the president and chief scientist of the Allen Institute for Brain Science in Seattle, and he was also a professor in Caltech. He wrote 5 books, including The Quest for Consciousness, Confessions of a Romantic Reductionist, The Feeling of Life Itself, and more. So, Professor Christof Koch, thank you so much for coming today. How are you?
Thank you. Thank you very much for having me on your show, Ro. I appreciate it.
Wow, it's my pleasure. It's truly my pleasure. Now, I suggested in our pre-conversation, I suggested 2 routes for our conversation today. One is the nature of consciousness, and 2 is the problem of free will. But I think that there is something more profound. The progress that neuroscience has achieved is remarkable. For the first time, questions that were in the realm of philosophy, theology, religion, can be measured in the laboratory. We have the Benjamin Libet experiment, and we have other experiments as well. Do you think that this is a good thing, that now for the first time we can measure and not just speak metaphysics?
Yeah, that's called progress. We begin to understand the world better. I think it's essential. It's a human condition. We always try to understand what goes on. Philosophy is good, but philosophy is very limiting in the sense that you can speculate endlessly without coming to any conclusions. The advantage of science is there's a clear arrow there. There's an arrow of progress. We come from a place where we know less to a place where we know more. This also has practical implications. I can build tools to help people. I can study consciousness in people who have diseases of consciousness and understand something better about the place of consciousness within, in the universe. So to me, it seems hugely beneficial thing.
Okay, so let's move on to a harder question. Your work owes a lot to the work of Roi Yozevitch, the father of neuroscience. And again, your work owes a lot to many great neuroscientists in the past. And this is how science works, one progress, one brick at a time. But my question is, do your work also has a depth to Descartes, Leibniz, John Searle, for example? Because it seems that you match, so the depth that you have for Roi Yozevitch is much bigger than the depth if you have to René Descartes.
Well, I don't know whether you can quantify that. I think people, particularly René Descartes, who is sort of the father of the modern way we in the 21st century conceive of the mind-body problem. That's due to one person, René Descartes, a physicist, a mathematician, and a philosopher. And so one cannot, it's very difficult to overestimate that impact. Or to more recent philosophers like John Searle. Of course, we also need experimentalists, so all of us together can hopefully jointly better understand this place we find ourselves in, this universe.
So do you count also on the work of John Searle? Because when reading your book, I have David Charmelon. What's his name? Just a second. David Chalmers, yes.
Chalmers.
It's not a good example when you say, listen, he is not interested in the laboratory findings, in the measurable experiments, okay?
But he has posed, that's true, but he has posed questions like the Chinese room example that really challenge the mind. And I think this is one. So I think the attitude I take to philosophy, I have an undergraduate degree philosophy, my study is full of philosophy books. It's fun to read. You should listen to the best philosophers, the questions they ask. The answers often aren't very convincing, but the questions they ask, often they're more fundamental, they're more challenging than the questions a biologist or physicist or chemist would answer. And it's not a competition who's sort of better at understanding. If you look at all sciences, including the oldest of all sciences of astronomy, it always first came sort of, before. Yeah, or with philosophy, and it comes out of philosophy. Then it's sort of including metaphysics. It comes to natural science, and today it's called science and physics and biology and all of that. So it's a common trend that first problems are uniquely considered by philosophers before we have the experimental means to observe and to intervene, which is what we can do in the brain today.
Okay, and
which we can.
Yes.
Which, interestingly, we cannot do in astronomy. So the oldest of all sciences is astronomy. There we can only observe and maybe predict. In brains, we cannot only observe, we can actually also perturb the brain and intervene in a way that we can't do when we study stars.
And I think that this brings us back to Brent and Russell in Problems of Philosophy, written in 1912, that philosophy, the true value of philosophy is posing questions and not particularly giving answer. And I think that this is exactly what you said. So with your permission, let me quote two sentences from your book, Confessions of a Romantic Reductionist, okay? How can activity in the brain trigger feelings? This is just one question. And then, on the one hand, is the brain the most complex object in the known universe, a material thing subject to the laws of physics. On the other end is the world of awareness, the sights, the sounds of life, of fear, anger, love, lust, and enumi. Okay? And this is like the famous old mind-body problem. But this mind-body problem is not synonym to the consciousness problem. So could you please draw a line between consciousness problem and the mind-body problem?
Well, I mean, the mind-body problem is many problems. It's this problem, as we mentioned earlier, that René Descartes really put on the table. Aristotle, for instance, thought about it very differently. So we have a physical body that's a piece of the furniture of the universe. You know, my brain belongs to the same class of object as this coffee cup or as the stars. It's made out of atoms and subnuclear particles and maybe ultimately strings. It obeys the same laws of quantum mechanics and relativity as everything else in the universe. But in addition to, I have this internal view looking out at the world, right? I'm actually seeing the world, I'm hearing the world, I'm loving, I'm fearing, I'm dreading, I'm bored, right? Those are all conscious states. And if you go back to the foundational equation of physics, there's nothing there about consciousness. In quantum mechanics, there's nothing. In relativity, there's nothing. In chemistry, in the periodic table, there's no consciousness. In the genes, there's no consciousness, yet we are conscious. And so that's been the challenge. How do we take these two separate views, on the one hand of the material world, on the other hand of our consciousness, and unite them so that we have a single view? Most modern philosophers, like Dan Dennett, for example, most famously, they say effectively, sorry, Christof, you're confused. There really isn't anything like consciousness. All there is ultimately is just behavior. You have people that talk, you have people that move, or animals that they don't talk, but they move about. But there isn't anything like it, truly like consciousness. It's just a big confusion, which to me is just complete nonsense. But this is
the very inherent or intrinsic feeling that you have, Dan Dennett dismiss as just an illusion, which brings me back to Thomas Sowell, which some ideas are so stupid that only people in academia can believe in them. So now, just a second.
Roi, but it's very widespread. Lots of philosophers think, well, because clearly matter doesn't admit to consciousness, therefore we just confuse. It can't exist.
Now again,
because my theory doesn't account for it.
In the theory of light, we don't have red. We don't have the experience of red. We have something else. We have an electromagnetic wavelength. In, I think, 4,000 Armstrong, but it's not red. It's something completely different. And you cannot explain red to blind. Okay? So this is like the two things. And you say, when asked what is consciousness, you say it is experience. Okay? Am I correct?
Yes, red.
Am I correct? And you said,
yes. And you just gave an example. Seeing red. Red is an experience.
Okay, now again, it brings me back to Justice Stewart quote regarding the definition of pornography. I know it when I see it. So it's very hard to define, but when you feel it, you know that you're consciousness. But my question is one, we also have experience during our REM sleep. So what's the difference? Because many people will say that when we sleep, we are unconscious. So how do you work with sleeping as being part of an experience?
Yes, so dreaming is a subset of conscious experiences. It's not the same as regular consciousness because you don't have the self, and you typically don't have the sense of self observing, right? You are more like an actor in a movie. Something is happening to you, but typically in most normal dreams, you don't have the self-reflecting part. Oh, I'm flying. Oh, I'm meeting my dad who died 20 years ago, right? You don't have that. But otherwise, it's a conscious experience. There are other parts of sleep, so-called deep sleep, when you're truly not there. So sleep, dreaming is a conscious state, as are very many other states. For example, when you're taking certain drugs, certain psychedelics. Again, if you're taking something like the toad, 5-MeO-DMT, you may completely lose the sense of self, but you're highly conscious. So those are just different types of experiences.
So you are one with the world, something like this, and this is a totally different experience.
Correct.
So again, you say, according to what you define, sleep or REM sleep is also part of a conscious state. And of course,
no, I'm sorry. I'm saying something slightly different. I'm saying when your body from the outside looks to be asleep, sometimes you have what's called REM sleep, and then typically you have these conscious experiences called dreaming. At other times, when you're in deep sleep, you aren't there. So yes, even during
I'm talking about deep REM sleep, not deep NREM sleep. Deep REM sleep, you also consider in your theory as a different conscious state, but still it's a conscious.
Yeah. Yes.
Okay, because many people say, it's something different. And again, there is a guy who thought he dreamt that he was a butterfly, and you cannot distinguish, and you cannot distinguish reality from dreaming. So many people say,
but both are conscious states. There's no question. Precisely because of the person who dreamt he was a butterfly. You can't tell the difference. Both are conscious experiences. In one case, your body is paralyzed and, in the dark, typically. In the other case, you move about, but both are conscious experiences.
Okay, so, and let me go from this. In 2012, you wrote a book, Confessions of a Romantic Reductionist. And reductionists mean that all phenomena, I think, but I will say what I think reduction is, and then you tell me if I got it wrong. Reductionism is that all phenomena that we see or experience in nature can be reduced to the simple and most fundamental laws of physics. Would you say that this is a fair description of what reductionism is?
Yes.
Okay, but you are also romantic. And let me just quote two things, okay? One, the philosopher Hilary Putnam has pointed out, even the simple fact that a square peg won't fit into a round hole cannot be explained in terms of molecules and atoms, but only at a higher level of analysis involving rigidity and geometry. And many people claim that the Beethoven Ninth Symphony simply cannot be understood via pressure sound waves. So it seems like what you think about Dan Dennett, about consciousness doesn't exist. People say, listen, Christof, can we reduce the human phenomena, the human experience to chemistry? This is like an even more absurd idea, no?
No, so I think what I was trying to grasp in 2012 with romantic reductionists is exactly this notion that to understand things like consciousness, you also have to have a holistic view. You may have to look at not necessarily at the most basic, let's say, atomic or subatomic or superstring level, but you may have to look at levels in between, like the levels of neurons. And you may have to understand things like consciousness as properties of certain systems that in some sense cannot be reduced to the properties of the underlying individual components. But you can derive them in very long ways. I'm not saying there's something supernatural or there. I'm still saying you can still understand things like consciousness within the natural framework, just not in a classical reduction. You know,
yes, I'm sorry.
Yeah, so what I was trying to grasp with this title, Romantic Reductionist, is the notion that not everything can be reduced to the lowest level. So, you know, Lucretius, famous, the Lucretian universe, you know, the Roman poet, De Rerum Natura, said there's atoms and the void. And in that sense, I think that that's not correct, that if you look at the atoms, they can give rise to certain systems like the brain that have inherent system properties that can be characterized by their causal interaction, but that don't exist at the atomic level, that only exist, let's say, at the levels of neurons. And that is the level that ultimately sort of constitutes what consciousness is. So consciousness has a physical substrate, the brain, but by itself, it is different from the underlying physical substrate, but it's still very lawful. It's still natural. It's not extra. It's not supernatural, if you see what I mean, in this view of consciousness.
Yes, but you know, maybe, and for me, you know, it's like we try to hold as hard as we can on the 19th century materialism, where the only thing that exists is matter, and therefore we have those very big questions because we need or we want to view, to interpret, to understand the world just as matters in physical realm. But maybe this notion of, you know, being hardcore materialist cannot explain such very complex phenomena like consciousness. And we need to shift to a different paradigm. Would you agree that this might be possible?
Yes, so the theory that I talk about, integrated information theory, says that what really truly exists is not the underlying physical substrate, because that doesn't exist for itself. What truly exists for itself is consciousness in you and me, in dogs, maybe in lots of other systems. That's what truly exists. It has a physical substrate, which is made out of matter, you know, atoms and neurons, but that doesn't exist for itself. Only my consciousness exists for itself, or your consciousness exists for itself. That's, I think, the solution. I mean, that's a solution I advocate for.
And what is it made of, this consciousness? Can we trace it? Can we trace it in the laboratory? What do I even look for? It's like an equation, or it's like, you know,
no,
a tissue.
You're looking for, you're looking
tissue.
for complex. Yes, you're looking for certain types of complex brain tissue. In fact, we're now getting ready to build a conscious meter. What is the conscious meter? You have patients where you don't know whether they're conscious or not. They're in a vegetative state. So they may be unable to move their eyes. They may be unable to move their fingers. They're unable to speak. But sometimes they open their eyes. Sometimes they close their eyes. They have a wake-sleep cycle. You don't know whether they're conscious. And the idea of a conscious meter is to hit the brain, metaphorically speaking, in this case with the magnetic field, and to probe the reactivity of the brain and thereby analyze its ability to integrate and differentiate information. And we know from many experiments now in patients and people, if that complexity is high enough, the patient is conscious. If the complexity is low enough, the patient is unconscious or the subject is unconscious. And so we're beginning to understand practically what are the physical substrate of consciousness in the brain.
Which brings me to Marvin Minsky in Society of Minds and the concept of emergence. Now, the concept of emergence, if I understand it correctly, say the following. Some qualities just emerge as the system becomes more and more complex. For example, the quality wetness. One cannot say that a single H2O molecule is wet, but when you combine many such molecules, the quality wetness emerge. And this, many people say, okay, this is basically consciousness. When the system becomes more and more complex, it will be, the conscious level will be higher. Would you agree?
No. At least, according to integrated information, there is not emergence. Either you're conscious or you're not conscious. You can, in principle, even have a simple system if it has intrinsic causal power. So according to integrated information theory of consciousness, consciousness ultimately is nothing but causal power. So you can go back to Aristotle. Everything in the world has causal power. There's any system that has causal power upon itself is a little bit conscious. And this could be a very simple system in principle. So unlike water, which you have what's called this weak emergence, right? As you said, one H2O isn't wet, but you take 10 to the 23, then you get wetness. Consciousness is different. Now, of course, if you get big brains like our brains, you can get lots of consciousness. But in principle, if you have a small system, you can get a little bit of consciousness. That feels like something. The distinguishing feature of consciousness, it feels like something to be this little thing.
And are there different levels of consciousness? Can I say this person is more conscious than this person?
In principle, yes. In practice, I mean, just like with IQ, you can certainly say some people have a higher IQ and some people have a lower IQ. In principle, according again to IIT, you can measure the amount, the quantity of consciousness. It's called by the Greek, labeled by the Greek letter phi. And in principle, you can assign phi to people, to children, to demented people, to fetus, to dogs, to cats, to worms. In principle, you can measure phi always by looking at the physical substrate, the underlying physical substrate that constitutes consciousness ultimately.
So if you find using your consciousness meter that lobsters do have consciousness, you are vegetarians, so it doesn't bother you, but we will need to stop, cooking them in the way we are doing right now. Many people say, why we cook lobsters the way we cook them? Because their brain is so simple that they just cannot feel pain. They cannot be conscious.
We know already that, we know all mammals are conscious, right? We know dogs are conscious, cats are conscious, cows are conscious, pigs are conscious, yet we still eat them. Yes, I'm a vegetarian because of that, but people have no trouble eating conscious creatures. In fact, people have no trouble being cruel to humans, which we know, they're conscious. So I don't think, unfortunately, that's going to stop. Even if you look at this, a system like a lobster, that's a very complicated nervous system that has, 600 million years of evolution behind it, just as much as you have.
Now, I read Roger Scruton about human nature. And
yes.
Do you find anything that is not just by quantity, but quality regarding the consciousness that my dog has and the consciousness that I have? Is just my consciousness is more complex, or we are talking about something completely different? My idea to self-reflect, for example.
You're going to die one day.
Yes.
That knowledge, for better or worse, my dog does not have. I think it makes a huge difference. My dog lives in the here and now. Creatures, all animals live in the here and now. Maybe, great apes, they might know a little bit. Yeah, so
about planning.
Yeah. Or maybe, if you look at great apes, what do they do when a member of their tribe dies? They don't seem to have a long-term relationship to a dead for them, after a couple of hours, it's just it's just an object. It's not a member of their tribe anymore. So this is probably for better knowledge. We have self-awareness. We have very high degrees of self-awareness, and then we have language. Now, are those quantitative or qualitative skills? Very difficult to say. You know, at some point, look at the computers today and look at them 30 years ago. Today, you can take this and you can talk to Siri and Alexa, right? Now, is that a quantitative difference or is that a qualitative difference?
It's a great question, and I really don't know. I had my PhD in artificial intelligence, and I keep pondering about this ever since. You know, I try to read everything I can, you know, Rebooting AI by Gary Marcus.
Yes.
And
yes.
many other books. And I think this is a very hard questions because
yes.
we know that GPT-3, for example, or many
yes.
other convolutional neural networks, we don't assign consciousness to them. There is something profoundly different, which brings me back to the Chinese Room by John Searle. You know, there is like the secret ingredient of a living creature that we haven't been able to duplicate yet. And part of your work is try to duplicate this feeling, yes?
Well, yes and no. You cannot compute consciousness. Even if you made a perfect computer simulation of you and I, okay, where I include all your brain neurons like Henry Markham of the Blue Brain wanted to do, and I model all of your brain and body, of course, this computer simulation is going to wake up and say, I'm conscious. But it's just as much conscious as it gets wet inside a simulation of a rainstorm. Just like you can simulate the black hole at the center of our galaxy without being afraid of being sucked into the gravity around your simulation, consciousness is also like that. It's a causal power. You can simulate the effect of it, but you don't actually get the causal power. So you cannot simulate consciousness. You have to build it. So in principle, we could build it if we use neuromorphic computers. But even Alexa, you know, you can ask, do you have Alexa?
Yes, of course.
Ask her whether she's conscious. Go ahead.
Just a second. Where is Alexa? Just a second. Let me ask Siri. Hey, Siri. Are you conscious?
Well, I do journal every day.
It's maybe my accent. Let's do it again. Hey, Siri. Are you conscious?
I'm a virtual assistant, so I only know what I've been programmed to understand.
Okay.
All right.
Oh, yes. She's very conscious about this.
She avoids the answering the question. Yeah, but of course you can get her to program. Yes, I'm conscious. Right? That's trivial.
And we go back to the Turing test and what Judea Pearl told me in our conversation. If you can fake it, you have it. So if we program a computer that acts as if it has consciousness, so maybe it has, but but we still don't feel the same. It's not, something is missing. And I, as a religious person, think that this something that is missing cannot be interpreted or cannot be measured using the materialist work frame. We need another thing. We need there is a secret ingredient there that we can emulate, that you can simulate, that we can fake it, but Siri doesn't have consciousness. Even if she says, yes, I have consciousness and I'm very happy, I'm very sad, it's not the same thing. Would you agree?
I totally agree with you. In fact, I attended 2 months ago, I was in Vatican. 3 months ago, I was in the Vatican in Rome, making this point at a conference in the Vatican, sort of trying to understand and meet the challenge of AI, particularly when AI is going to claim that it's also conscious, that it's sentient like us. Where does that leave us? What are the challenges there? And firstly, I would say even simulation, unlike Judea Pearl, faking it is not the same as being it. You can simulate the weather, you can simulate gravity. That doesn't mean you have the causal power of a rainstorm, or that doesn't mean you have the causal power of gravity, or you don't have the causal power of consciousness. So in that sense, I agree with you, Roy. It is something above and beyond the matter. However, I don't believe, although, you know, I grew up as a devout Catholic, and, you know, of course, you grow up with the idea of a soul. You know, this is the Cartesian soul. This is exactly what Descartes says. Well, that's a soul. And here is the, you know, res cognitive, that's a cognitive stuff. And then there's physical stuff, including the brain. And then somehow the physical stuff talks to the cognitive stuff. Right, but that's always been the big challenge. How, by what laws does physics influence my soul, and how can my soul influence physical stuff? And so IRT looks at that and solves it and saying, yes, there is something above the physical, the unfolded causal powers, but ultimately they depend on the causal, they depend on the underlying physical substrate. And if you remove the physical substrate, consciousness will also be gone.
Yes, definitely. And I think that many people are just don't grasp this very idea, because what Descartes said is that you have the body and you have the mind, and the only place they meet is like in the back of your mind. It's called I don't know how you say it in English.
The pineal gland.
Oh, the pineal gland, okay. But otherwise, they are completely separate. Now, we know from the work of Arturo Damasio, Descartes' Mistake, and David Eagleman, and your work as well, that when you have a brain damage, it affects your personality. So we cannot say that our soul, our mind, whatever this mind is, yes, is unrelated to the body. And again, every phenomena that we experience as a mind, as a conscious mind, can be also viewed using the EEG. For example, like love in any way, or like Ramachardan say, even something about being holy, yes? Something about being holy, you can measure these things. So every phenomena has, in some way, to some extent, a physical tracing that you can follow. Yeah. But it's not the same thing, and which leads me to the question of free will. If I take the materialist world point or worldview that everything is reductionism, so in other words, when I decided to lift my hand, it was a chain of action, okay, that started with one neuron firing in my brain to the visual cortex, to the motor cortex, etc., etc. So then if there was an electric field, the neuron would have must be fired. And if there wasn't an electric field, so the neuron would have been fired. Therefore, you can't grasp the concept of free will if you reduced everything to the physical laws. Is this a fair way to put it?
Correct. According again to Dan Dennett, it's just an illusion, just like consciousness is.
So in other words, and we have Chaim Soplinsky from the Hebrew University. We have Chaim Soplinsky from the Hebrew University, yes. And he said, listen, I'm a religious person. I'm an Orthodox Jew, but after what I encountered and what I found about everything, I just simply don't believe in free will because of all the measurement, all the experiments. So it's a very hard thing to do because many people have this like intuitive, intrinsic free will. Yes, I can actually decide whether to lift my right hand or my left hand. And many people say this is an illusion. Would you say that free will is an illusion?
No. It matters. There's a famous poem called Invictus. It matters not how straight the course, how charged with punishment the scroll. I'm the master of my fate. I'm the captain of my soul, not my neurons. Yes, of course, for every action, including lifting my right hand or my left hand, there's going to be a physical substrate in the brain. No question about it. No question whatsoever. And if I time log all the times I raise my right hand and I look back in time, you know, like Ben Libet did a second before, whatever, I can see, of course, I can see neural correlates of that. It has to be. Because as you pointed out earlier, the consciousness is tightly linked to the underlying brain. But ultimately, the causal level at which decisions happen is this integrated whole that is my that is my consciousness. That makes the decision, not my neurons. So it's simply not true to say my neurons made me do it. When I have to make a decision where I think whether I want to do this and that, and I deliberate, and I have my moral framework, and I take a decision, it is me, it is my consciousness that executed that decision, not the underlying neurons. Although physically I can trace the chain of events in my brain, of course, because it's not separated from it. But the right level of causation is consciousness, is not the underlying neurons.
But let's say that I want to believe you, Christof. I do want to believe you, but then I read the Benjamin Libet experiment and I say, if I know
Yes.
in advance, 2 seconds before I lift my hand, that the readiness potential has already left the building, yes, and I can know in advance which hand you're going to raise. So it's like what you say, my brain sent me a photocopy of the decision just after the decision has been made, but I have an illusion that I made the decision just 2 seconds after the decision has been actually made. This is mind-blowing.
Well, yes and no. It's not mind-blowing when you think about it. Yes, of course, there has to be physical substrate, unlike unless you believe in a soul, where suddenly my soul comes in and perturbs the water of my brain, right? And I don't believe that. But so 2 points. A, this is never ahead of time. It's not that, okay, I'm going to monitor your brain and I predict in 2 seconds you're going to move something. No, it's after what you do is experimental. You do this 1,000 times in the lab, and then I look backwards, and then backwards I can always see this preparatory signal, this readiness potential, okay? Which is very different than doing it in a forward way, right? You understand the critical difference. But the other way you look...
difference, because I think that this is one of the most important points of your work. So if you can please repeat this difference, please.
So there are two, there's a conceptual and there's a huge methodological difference. The methodological difference is, it's one thing to say, okay, Roi, you know, a bunch of times, 200 times, raise your right hand or raise your left hand. Okay. And you do that. And then I look at your brain signal every time you moved your left hand versus every time you moved your right hand. And then I see, okay, there's this brain signal that starts 1 second ahead of time. That is very different from saying right now, I'm going to look at your brain and I'm going to predict whether you're going to move your right hand and the left hand. That's vastly more difficult and so far cannot be done, period. It's a huge difference, right? Conceptually,
okay. I thought, because I thought that in those experiments, I'm not talking specifically about the Benjamin Libet experiment, but other experiments showed to some extent that you can predict what hand will be raised. But you say not yet.
Left hand or right hand. No, but I mean, that's all after the fact.
No, I need before, because, okay. So
every time you move your right hand, this neuron fires, and every time you move the left hand, that neuron fires. That's very different from monitoring your brain in real time and saying, Roi, I predict in 2 seconds from now, you're going to move your hand. It's very different.
Okay, definitely. Now, I was, and I'm still is, a magician. And as magicians, we usually force cards, okay? And by force cards, I mean that I give you the card, and then I'm going to time, let's say that I want to force you like the Queen of Clubs, okay? So I'm going to put cards like this, and when you want to just call out stop.
Stop.
Yes, this?
Yes.
Okay, and
yes.
You see, this is a Queen of Clubs, okay? Just a second, 1, 2, 3. Okay, now what I did, besides being one hell of a magician, is that usually you don't have free will, you don't have free choice. And in magic, we take exploit of the thing because I can time you because you don't have free choice. And some people regarding the work of Benjamin Libet said, listen, we need to distinguish between 2 different words. One is the word pick. Pick a card, any card. It doesn't make any difference, okay? It's not going to change my life. And the other is choose, which is extremely different thing. I need to choose whether to marry Tzili or Gili, okay? So choose is much more important, much more profound. Therefore, I'm going to activate the free will, because free will doesn't occur every time that we take a decision. Most of the time, it's just heuristics, okay? And you can do it with a bunch of cards, yeah, of playing card, okay? So can you say, okay, free will doesn't occur all the time, but sometimes in, you know, in like the railroad, when you need to divert the train and to kill other people, sometimes in very hard decision, when you choose instead of pick, the Benjamin Libet won't work, because then free will emerge. What do you think?
We did an experiment. Yes, we did an experiment like that 10 years ago with a professor who's in Tel Aviv now, Liat Mudrik.
Yes,
you should get her on her show. She's in has a PhD in psychology and in philosophy, and we did exactly that: choosing versus picking. And yes, when you pick, you know, it's like I go to a department store, I pick one Coke versus the other Coke. It doesn't really matter; they're all Coke, right? So that's and which is very different from choosing. Should I go for a high caloric drink, or should I, you know, do something? Or more important, should I marry this person or not? Should I take that job or not? Once again, in a situation where you confronted with a dilemma, when there are two or more choices in your mind, should do this and that, you deliberate, you align reasons why you think you should do this or why you should do that, and then you choose according to your value system. I think that is a free decision. That is a freely willed decision, and you took it, not your underlying neurons.
And again,
you're looking at,
it might be that the decision of whom to marry is also related to the smell of your kindergarten teacher.
Of course,
like,
of course.
But again, it's not that it's deterministic. We cannot say that free will exists in a vacuum, okay? We are always being influenced by many, many things.
Correct.
But the final idea, yes, I am influenced by this, and I'm influenced by this, and I'm influenced by this. But again, you know, it is easier to go downhill, but sometimes, not always, sometimes I'm going to choose to climb uphill and not downhill. Although in statistics, the majority will go downhill. But I myself has the free will to do it. Although it's very, very hard to resist your downhill
impulse to go downhill.
Temptation.
Correct.
Yes. Okay. And
I am the master of my fate.
Okay. Yes. And one last question. There is a famous Israeli physicist, Yakir Aharonov, and he said about the free will problem the following things. The one thing that strikes us in free will that we need in order to free will to work, we need that the first neuron will be fired without an electric field. And many people, including Chaim Somplinsky, said it just cannot be done because the laws of physics are just universal everywhere. Right. But Yakir Aharonov say something different. He say, listen, maybe for very, very small systems, we need quantum mechanics. And for very, very high-speed systems, we need relativity. And maybe for very, very complex systems, like the human brain, we need a different model of physics that goes the other way around. In fact, the first neuron is fired from electric field from the future. And if you do the math, if you do the equations, it is possible. So maybe we need a different form of physics where the electric field comes from the future. What do you think?
I have seen no evidence are possible. I haven't seen any evidence whatsoever. I think you can have free will, and you have free will without any fancy exotic physics. I think your brain to first order follows good old classical physics. Maybe you get some quantum noise, but that injects indeterminacy, right? That doesn't make a decision free. It just makes it less predictable.
Yes.
But otherwise, you have to look at the right level of the right causal level, and the causal level aren't individual neurons, although you might well be able to predict things from individual neurons. The relevant causal level is a level of at which my consciousness and my conscious deliberations occur. for these difficult decisions, the ones that you mentioned where you have to go uphill.
And
that is the level of consciousness.
And what you said is very important because, again, noise like quantum noise or chaos theory just inject noise and make the decision less predictable. But when we talk about free will, it's something completely different, okay? Because we think and say it's not just a random decision. It's a decision with our mind. So,
my decision, correct?
Yes, it's a mind decision. Therefore, chaos theory and quantum theory cannot explain cannot explain free will. They can explain our inability to predict the decision, but it's not free will.
Correct. Yes.
Okay. Wow, Christof, it was super.
So we pretty well agree on most things.
Yes, definitely. Just beside, the being vegetarian, but beside this, yes. Wow, it is so interesting. What do you think, and this is my last question, what do you think will be the next breakthrough in neuroscience?
Well, I mean, the two exciting areas for me is psychedelics and brain-machine interfaces, things like Neuralinks.
Yes.
This year, they'll probably do their first big implant in humans. And then psychedelics and the ability to really help us with many psychiatric conditions where we have very primitive tools.
Would you think that after Neuralink, after the era of Neuralink in 2, 5, 10 years, we will experience reality in a different way?
Oh, that's going to take many, many decades because progress is so slow. The current most advanced brain-machine interface is 30 years old. And once Neuralink will enter the market this year, probably, still it's going to take decades or two. And right now, these operations will only be possible in patients that are severely disabled. This is not going to be for a healthy individual. That's far in the future. I will certainly not experience that anymore, given my age. I just turned 1,000,000 years in binary. Maybe you or your generation or your children's generation will experience this because progress, particularly in the biomedical domain, is very slow because of risks.
We know with the vaccine of the COVID. So Christof Koch, thank you so much for your time and for your groundbreaking work. It just was mind-blowing speaking with you today. Thank you so much.
Thank you. And thanks for asking these good questions, Roi.
Okay. Bye-bye. Thank you.